everybody. Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter, in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage. Then and there, the whole race enters with me. In 1892, Anna Julia Cooper contested the notion that Black women were not central to the progress of Black people and America as a nation. In 1984, Paula Giddings reminded us that Black women had always played a central role in pushing the boundaries and articulating the demands of racial and gender justice. We learned the names of women who marched into the face of adversity. Many of us read this book and found new models of the kind of women we hoped we could be, that we would be. Here on this campus in the early 90s, in a study group of students interested in Black history, I first came across When and Where I Enter. I learned that the question asking, direct, sometimes mouthy young woman that I was my birthright. It was my inheritance, passed down to me by my foremothers, who asked, who demanded, and who got results. So today in 2019, we gather on the ground where our ancestors toiled to reaffirm women's place as leaders, to hear their voices, and to celebrate their genius. But most importantly, to say thank you to Paula Giddings for your voice, and thank you for the world you opened up and the challenges you have given us all to think more about the ways our community, our nation, and our society can be more free. And the reminder to always act, to do what is necessary to make it so. Remembering, in the words of Paula Giddings, that victory is often a thing deferred and rarely at the summit of courage. What is at the summit of courage is freedom. The freedom that comes with the knowledge that no earthly thing can break you. This is why we're here today. So we're gonna first start by thanking Paula Giddings. Can we say that? Thank you. Stand up so we can say it to you. Our first panel, sitting here already, we bring out a panel of pioneers in Black women's studies. Their full bios are in the program, but I want to tell you a little bit about each one of them so that when they start talking, you are prepared for what comes out of their mouths. I'm setting the bar very high with this introduction. As I thought about who would be some of the women who I would like to see on this stage, the first thing I thought about was, who are the women I read? Who are the women who, after reading them, the way that I teach, the way that I write, the way that I think will be forever changed? And I hope that as you hear them, the way that you think, the way that you write, the way that you teach will be forever changed. So first we have Dr. Cheryl Wall, who is a literary scholar and the Board of Governors Zora Neale Hurston Professor of English at Rutgers University. Next, we have Dr. Renita Weems, who is an independent scholar, a scholar of the Hebrew Bible, and the first Black woman to do a PhD in Old Testament studies at Princeton Theological Seminary. Next, we have Elsa Barkley Brown, who is a historian of Black women's history and professor of history and women's and gender studies at the University of Maryland. Their panel will be moderated by Dr. Melinda Price, PV class of 1995, who is a, well, if Ruth said woo woo, the rest of us should say woo woo too. So PV class of 1995. She majored in physics, y'all, so that's interesting. So, who is a legal scholar and current director of the Gaines Center for Humanities at the University of Kentucky. Please join me in welcoming this wonderful panel. Before they start, if you look in your programs, you will see that this is being live streamed, but there are also hashtags available for you to tweet about, to use your social media to talk about the event as it's happening today. So please feel free to put us, make us trend on social media. Thank you so much.
So the panelists today, thank you so much for joining us. I'm honored to moderate this panel. Each of them are going to give an opening remarks. I'll move and ask a couple questions, and then we will invite a few questions for the audience. And for those students who are in the room, at 9:50, I'm going to take a brief pause. So 10:50. I'm sorry, I'm still on East Coast time. At 10:50, we're going to take a brief pause for you to move to your next classes as you need. I just want to give you a heads up. So we'll begin with Professor Barkley Brown.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's exciting to be here with you. First, let me say a word of thanks for inviting me to Prairie View and inviting me to this celebration of Paula Giddings and this celebration of Black women's history and Black women's studies. My appreciation to Dr. Price, Dr. Simmons, and wherever Carol Campbell and Lisa Fields are, thank you for getting us together. I want to offer a few vignettes to think about the importance of when and where I enter and the state and status of Black women's history and Black women's studies then in 1984 and now. Let us begin with the title, When and Where I Enter, the Impact of Black Women on Race and Sex in America. Just stop right there and ponder the impact of Black women on race and sex in America. That makes sense now in 2019, but imagine in 1984, not the impact of race and sex on Black women, but the impact of Black women on race and sex in America. In a time when many in the historical profession were having a hard time imagining that Black women had a history, and/or that Black women had a history that there was sufficient enough evidence to tell, imagine a book that calls out in its title and on its cover the idea that Black women have been central to the structures of American society, have been central to how race is structured, how sex is structured, and not just for themselves, and Black men, but how race and sex is structured in the society as a whole, and central not just in their bodies and what is done to them, but central in how they have imagined and reimagined race and sex and pushed those imaginings into the world. In the opening chapter, Giddings brings to fore many of the issues that have been central to the development of Black women's history: class, respectability, sexual violence. We're only on page 9 when she puts racialized sexual violence on the table. In thinking about class and respectability, I always find this a great sentence to teach. And yes, I like to teach sentences. There's so much one can grasp from a good sentence. In talking about the aftermath of the 1892 lynching in Memphis of 3 men who were friends of both Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell, Giddings writes that this changed both their lives. Quoting When and Where I Enter, their approaches were different, symbolized by Wells perching a pistol, situated as she was within the belly of the beast, while Terrell, no doubt wearing her accustomed white gloves, an expensive strand of pearls, went to the White House. When and Where I Enter, and in When and Where I Enter, and in her later works on Ida B. Wells, Giddings unpacks the activism, but also the ideology of Wells, and the ways in which Wells' work changes understandings of race and sex, changes understandings of racial violence, puts sexualized racial violence not just in the picture, but to the front. And in the sentence, though, there's more than that. In the sentence, there is a nuanced understanding of radicalism, a nuanced understanding of the various forms and presentations of radical action, the radical activism of Wells and her pistol and her forthright demands, and there is Terrell with her white gloves and pearls going off to the White House with no less forthright demands. And there is an understanding of how class has shaped the perspectives and the forms of work and radicalism of both these women. an understanding that shapes much of what Giddings is doing the rest of this book as she takes us through the political work of the 19th century abolition and suffrage movements, the Club Women's Movement, the work of Mary McLeod Bethune, the civil rights activism. That's a sentence that I teach a lot, and yes, we usually spend a whole day on that sentence. To step back a little in time and suggest something of the reception of when and where I enter, there were, of course, the praising reviews. But one small antidote to give a sense of the time. In 1984, I was teaching at Dartmouth College. One day, one of my colleagues came to my office with a beautifully wrapped present. It was a copy of When and Where I Enter. She presented this with a sense of excitement and some sense of wonder. There is a whole book on Black women's history. A curious sense that this was so rare and that I, a Black woman, a historian of Black women, would not be aware of it. I don't mean to mock this gift. It was a lovely and loving gesture from someone who befriended me in a very antagonistic place. Rather, I tell this to suggest something of the kinds of impact When and Where I Enter was having in terms of a bit of recognition in the larger academy that yes, there is a history, and yes, it can be written. Now, let me be clear about the ground in which When and Where I Enter lay. In 1978, Sharon Harley and Rosalind Turbart Penn, then graduate students at Howard University, working on dissertations, published their edited collection, The Afro-American Woman, Struggles and Images. In 1979, 5 years prior to the publication of When and Where I Enter, the Association of Black Women Historians was founded, organizing the first national conference on Black women's history, as well as workshops on how to research Black women's history. But there was still much skepticism about how much could be said about Black women's history. Could it be a field that people studied in? Could it even be a class? About 5 years before the publication of When and Where I Enter, as I was discussing possible dissertation topics with my advisor, and I noted my interest in working on Richmond, Virginia, and I spoke of Maggie Lena Walker, my advisor quickly told me that while she was an important woman, there would be nothing else to learn about Black women there. She was an anomaly in being worth any historical attention. I hope my work since then, in looking both at Walker and the community of women around her, and later in looking at the political activity and ideology of Black Richmonders, women, men, and children in the post-emancipation era, has put that to rest. And let me say, I insert children here because I think in the fashion of Anna Julia Cooper's phrase, when and where I enter, when and where I enter, the whole race enters with me, that one of the geniuses of Black women's history and Black women's studies is that when one begins to unfold it, what that does is also open up a whole lot of other people's histories, working class history, children's history, men's history as well. But in the late 70s and early 80s, it was still a question in much of the academy, could there be a history of Black women? And therefore, the publication in 1984 of When and Where I Enter, that same year, Dorothy Sterling's collection of primary sources, We Are Your Sisters, Black Women in the 19th Century, and the next year in 1985, Deborah Gray White's Art I a Woman, Female Slaves in the Plantation South, and Jacqueline Jones' Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, Black Women Working Family from Slavery to Freedom, hopefully meant that fewer grad students had their hopes and aspirations of studying Black women's history questioned as mine were. In its attention to the artistic and literary output of Black women, as well as the political activism of Black women, These ideas, When and Where I Enter, sort of foreshadows the current insistence on Black women's intellectual history, an insistence that still receives much pushback. Keisha Blaine, in writing her recently published book, Set the World on Fire, Black Nationalist Women and the Global Struggle for Freedom, notes that when she was working on that book and giving a talk about that at a professional conference and using the word theorist to describe the Black women she was talking about, that a white male historian got up from the audience and asked why she was calling them theorists, weren't they merely activists? Blaine discusses this by way of noting still the problems of thinking about Black women as intellectuals 35 years after Paula Giddings made that really clear in When and Where I Enter. I recall a similar pushback when I was giving a talk about Maggie Lena Walker as a banker at a business history conference. And I was questioned, wasn't that just activism, not really banking? I wrote a paper called, When is a Banker Not a Banker? When she is a Black woman. Of course, Shanette Garrett Scott's new book, Banking on Freedom, Black Women in U.S. Finance Before the New Deal, sets the story straight on that. So I want to come back to the distinctions Giddings making in her title, What Happens When Black Women Enter. We are, in the next year, going to see a lot of acknowledgement of the suffrage movement, a lot of acknowledgement of racism within the suffrage movement, often within a context that sounds something like this. Given the movement's racism, Black women were routinely excluded or segregated from suffrage activism and events. Or we're going to see a lot of attention to including Black women by singling out those who were part of the National Women's Suffrage Association, despite its overall racist approach to women's suffrage, along with the lament that there isn't more to tell because Black women, unfortunately, didn't have the luxury of focusing on a single issue. Let us not be distracted by these tellings of the suffrage movement, by these limited efforts, ones that are designed, consciously or unconsciously, to make sure that the traditional narrative of what women's suffrage is, of who is a suffragist, of what is a women's suffrage organization, remain intact. The other story to tell, one that Paula Giddings is telling in When and Where I Enter. The other story to tell is a story of women's suffrage as constructed by Black women, a struggle that understood women's suffrage as part and parcel of a struggle for universal suffrage, not apart from it, a struggle in which the central organizations may or may not have been exclusively women's, a struggle in which suffrage probably wasn't the single focus issue. Black women are telling that story in both the histories they are constructing and in the on-the-ground ongoing efforts to cry out the struggle for women's suffrage is ongoing today. It's not done. It's not a 1920s thing. Just ask Stacey Abrams. So I want to end with just a note about the scope of Black women's studies. A woman whose story appears in When and Where I Enter and is central to Paula Giddings beginning to talk about sexual violence and thinking about sexual violence in slavery is the story of Rose Williams, who's enslaved in Texas, and who the white man she was enslaved to put her together, coupled her with an enslaved man named Rufus, and insisted over and over again on their coupling and her bearing children over and over and over again from that. And that's a story that Paula gives us in When and Where I Enter. I want to say something about the ways in which that story but also the construction in the last 35 years of the field of Black women's studies has added not just to what we know about women, but also what we know about men. By ending by calling out a recent 2019 book by Thomas Foster, Rethinking Rufus, Sexual Violations of Enslaved Men. To think that it was not just Rose Williams, but it was also Rufus who was been sexually violated there. And I hope this gives us some idea of the legacy of Anna Julia Cooper and the legacy of Paula Giddings. Thank you, Paula.
I cannot begin my remarks. Do you hear me? I can't begin my remarks without also thanking those who are responsible for making it possible for me and others of us to be here in this great event. Certainly Dr. Simmons for the work that she is doing here at Prairie View, and certainly my colleague and dear friend, Dr. I am from the generation where you always give honor to whom honor is due. It is a delight to be here. And I am going to experiment with being a Jetson when I'm really a Flintstone. Just this whole context, and we are accustomed to being at the microphone, so we are here around these chairs trying to pretend like we are not really lecturers who prefer the platforms. But I will try to read from my phone, from my cell, not telephone, from my cell, and see how this Flintstone makes this work. We are the books that we read. That's certainly true for those of us who grew up before YouTube and podcasts and streaming and the internet. We read ourselves woke. And there are some key works from the latter part of the 20th century that are slowly fading from memory. And yet we know that memory is a form of resistance, or can be a form of resistance. And I think meetings like this, conferences like this that Dr. Price has organized, is an act of resistance against fading memories. Memories about key texts, certainly from the last century and centuries before. All of these texts, the books that we are here centered around even this week, When and Where I Enter, which is itself is centered around another set of texts behind it, are all blueprint for our formation as feminist and womanist thinkers, blueprint for what it means and has meant to be a Black female intellectual, and blueprint for what it means to be a race woman, a scholar. What does it mean, and what has it meant, Brittany Cooper asked, to be a Black female intellectual? I can certainly say from my own case, as a Black woman whose PhD is in the field of biblical studies, I did not grow up to become a scholar. I did not grow up to become a professor. I grew up like Black girls in the segregated South of the 50s and 60s. I grew up to be a teacher, not ever dreaming to become a scholar or an academic, and not even a professor, even though I was raised in Atlanta, Georgia, around the Atlanta University system. I only dreamed of becoming a teacher. And yet, the journey from being a little Black girl in Atlanta, Georgia in the 50s and 60s to becoming the first African-American woman to receive a PhD in Old Testament, to becoming the first Black woman to become tenured at Vanderbilt University, the first Black woman to do the Lyman Beecher lectures at Yale University. You do not grow up, you do not wake up one day saying to yourself, I want to be the first Black woman to do anything. Mm-hmm. You wake up wanting to say yes to opportunities, to doors that are open to you, to opportunities that come your way, to people saying to you, have you ever considered? I think you might want to consider becoming, have you ever considered? And that is how I became, in many ways, a black woman scholar. A TA wrote in the margins of a paper that I submitted, have you ever thought of a PhD? And a light went on. An invitation was extended. And so even now, I am accosted by students who want to know, do you think I should go on for my PhD? That depends, I answer. On what, they ask. It depends upon whether you love footnotes. Or to those who want to know whether they have what it takes to be a writer, that depends on what? You must love sentences. Or, do you think that I should become a minister? That depends on what? On whether you can live with the possibility of living with God's silence. I love footnotes. I love sources. I love the books behind the books. I love the books that went into writing the book. I loved reading about the people who were behind the book, which is why I became a biblical scholar, a scholar of religion. I was fascinated with the ways in which religious texts, in which the Christian text, the Judeo-Christian text, has shaped African American history, has shaped American discourse, has shaped Western politics and civilization. I did not become a religious scholar because I was religious, although I was, I guess, religious. But I became a scholar of religion because I was fascinated with also the ways in which black women have used biblical texts, religious discourse, religion, ritual, symbols, to shape and to explain and understand their reality. And when I was receiving or working on my PhD in the 1980s, I was working in a situation where I had to defend, explain, prove that black women were scholars, that black women were thinkers, that black women had resources of which I can build my dissertation about black women's religious experiences. We depended upon, we looked for books there at Princeton, where I was at the time, and needed books like When and Where I Enter. I remember its publication, and I remember the ways in which I relished reading When and Where I Enter, along with Hazel Carby, along with Patricia Collins, along with a number of others. I am reminded of one of my favorite sentences by the late, great Toni Morrison. And it was actually not in one of her books, which I love her novels, but it was actually in a 1971 essay, opinion piece that she wrote for the New York Times. And writing about the complicated relationship black women had at that time with the then what was called the Women's Lib movement, Morrison wrote about black women in terms of our notion about self-actualization and self-definition, quote, and she had nothing to fall back on, not maleness, not whiteness, not even ladyhood, not anything. And out of the profound desolation of her reality, she may very well have invented herself. To be a black woman scholar, especially in 1980s, was to invent your own self. It was to depend upon and look forward to and to archive and curate the writings of, we did not have the kind of scholarship that your generation has now. And so for someone like me who was in biblical scholarship, reading and using in footnotes and in sources for papers, reading Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, reading and needing books by Barbara Smith and Paula Giddings, needing and relying upon the works of historians, black women historians who were at that time mining 19th century and early 20th century black women writers like Anna Julia Cooper, like Frances Watkin Harper, and like any number of others, Rebecca Jackson Cox, and I'm just going on and on. We relied upon these historians to bring us the sources and the resources that we needed in order to do our dissertation, in order to demonstrate to hostile dissertation committees, advisors, professors, that indeed black women have been theorizing for centuries, and that indeed we have been activists as well as philosophers and theorists. So for someone like me who had a foot in, certainly in the scholar of the academic scholarship of religion, as well as wanted to also be a writer. So at that time I was writing for Essence magazine, as well as doing this church thing on the side. So I was one of those who was running between, in Queens, I was running to church on Sunday, and in New York, listening to feminists like Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and Florence Kennedy during the weekdays. And the church and the academy were two jealous lovers. So I did not tell the church that I was a feminist during the week, and I did not tell the feminists that I was a church girl on Sundays. And they made me pay for both of those worlds. But yet at the same time, I needed, in 1984, I needed footnotes. I needed sources. I needed theoretical frameworks. I needed texts on black women's intellectual history and black women's intellectual literary productions. And we relied on, as I've said before, June Jordan, Audre Lorde, Nikki Giovanni, Lorraine Hansberry, black women like Alice Walker and Toni K. Bambara, Zora Neale Hurston, and Margaret Walker, to provide us the source material to explain this or that about womanist ethics, theology, pastoral care. And we have all of these women, including Paula Giddings, to thank for providing those of us who were scrambling for resources. The absence prior to then caused hostility for me in my own department there at Princeton Theological Seminary. But once I was able to bring these books to class, to have to educate my own professors about the materials and who was writing and who were their colleagues at other universities if they were not at my own university. This was bruising work. This was work that cost you, that you had to teach your professor and yourself at the same time, that you had to teach your field and ask your field for credentials at the same time. But your generation, certainly those of you who are students here, we hope and we pray, and the reason why we come to events like this is to say that we are hoping that your generation will have it, if not easier, different. A different kind of hardness, if you will. As long as we are not the ones in charge of these PhD programs, it will always be difficult. But this is the work, as the late Dr. Katie Cannon said, this is the work that our souls must have. So you decide, as one of the wonderful books that changed my life about 10 years ago was a book that I came across. It was not by black women scholars, but it was called This Fine Place, So Far From Home. It was a collection of essays by academics from working class backgrounds. Academics from working class backgrounds who are writing about what it means to be a scholar when you grew up in when you yourself grew up in a very blue collar, working class background, and the class differences. And that in some ways education helps you, but in some ways education kills some things. And the ways in which you try to balance what it means to stand. And for me, most of my career as a professor was in predominantly white institutions as the first and I only taught mostly graduate students. So to be a black woman professor, standing before students who were and themselves in their late 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s sometimes, and I was the first black woman that they'd ever had as an instructor, and you're now 30, and you're now 40. And the pushback, and the challenge, and then not only to be their first black woman professor, and they are graduate students, but then to be a black woman professor handling their treasured biblical texts, their sacred scriptures, and to be doing all these new and different things with it, and to be challenging their cherished interpretations of these texts, and to be pushing back, and to say, this is not a course on what God said, this is a course on what Moses said, God said. It comes at a cost, but I stood and stand in the tradition of the Anna Julia Coopers and the Francis Jackson Watkins Harper, and the Nanny Helen Burroughs and the Pauli Murrow, and certainly when and where I enter, my whole race, my whole gender, sexuality, family, people, when and where I enter, we all enter together. Thank you.
Good morning. I am thrilled to be on the campus of Prairie View University and to be part of this amazing event. Can you hear me? Okay, great. I want first to give honor to your esteemed president, Dr. Ruth Simmons, who is our beacon. I thank Dr. Melanie Price, who was my colleague at Rutgers and has surely found a better home. And I also want to congratulate Paula Giddings, my longtime friend and cherished colleague. May you enjoy every minute of this day, which you so richly deserve.
Yes.
Now, I wanted to start by making 4 quick points about when and where I enter, and some of that will echo what you've already heard. Giddings describes her book as a narrative history of black women in America across the centuries. It is a history few of us knew in 1984. So its first contribution is its recuperation of the lives and work of many unsung heroes. Although when I read the book the first time, I knew who Ida B. Wells was, I did not know the details of her life. I am not sure I had actually heard the name Anna Julia Cooper, whose proud words give Giddings the title for her volume. Now, Cooper has since become a canonical figure in black women's studies. I was unaware of Fannie Barrier Williams, and what I knew of Nanny Burroughs came from women in my church whom she had inspired. Reading Giddings, I learned to think of Burroughs and the other women as historical actors. Point 2, as I reread When and Where I Enter for Today, I gained a renewed appreciation of Giddings as a storyteller. She never forgets that historian and storyteller share a common etymology. She has a particular skill for investing historical actors with complexity and psychological nuance. I have never forgotten the way she juxtaposes the figures of Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells in the book's first chapter. Initially, the well-educated, refined, and privileged Terrell seems to be the opposite of the fierce embattled, and prickly Wells. And of course, I'm sure like most readers, I identified with Wells. But then we learn of their common ties to Memphis and their shared grief and rage at the murder of their friend. We learn of their deep race pride, their profound sense of the value of Black womanhood. And we see in this chapter and in a thread running throughout the book that Wells and Terrell are soldiers in the same army. Point 3, Paula Giddings is a beautiful writer who knows how to turn a phrase and just open the book to any page and you will find a sentence. Point 4, good books generate good books. When and Where I Enter helped to set in motion an outpouring of books that document the history of Black women. I think, for example, of Evelyn Higginbotham's Righteous Discontent, the women's movement in the Black Baptist Church, 1880 to 1920. I think of Deborah White's Too Heavy a Load, Black Women in Defense of Themselves, 1894 to 1994. And I think of Brittany Cooper's Beyond Respectability, the intellectual thought of race women. The book that grows most directly and compellingly out of When and Where I Enter is, of course, Giddings' own Ida, A Sword Among Lions, Ida B. Wells and the Campaign Against Lynching. This magisterial biography is both a definitive documentation of a heroic life, a life made more heroic because it was lived under constant racist and sexist attack, and a thoroughgoing account of the movement to outlaw lynching in the United States. Paula Giddings is the rare scholar who has written not one, but two indispensable books. In her invitation, Professor Price asked me to reflect on the trajectory of my own career. I would trace its beginnings to 1970, a year when I sat, as the students in today's audience sit, in college lecture rooms. Mine were at Howard University. As an English major, I read greedily, especially in what were then called Black Lit courses. To be honest, my most memorable course was called Literature by and About the Negro. It was taught by the pioneering literary historian and poet Sterling Brown, so we did not complain about the title. Still, by the time I graduated, I had absorbed the consensus view that the 5 major Black writers were Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, and Leroy Jones, who was not yet Amiri Baraka. Around 1970, the literary landscape was abruptly remapped. Maya Angelou published I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Toni Morrison published The Bluest Eye. Alice Walker published The Third Life of Grange Copeland. Audre Lorde published Cables to Rage. Nikki Giovanni published Ray Creation. These books put Black women at the center of their own narratives. Indeed, Angelou, Morrison, and Walker invented protagonists who were young, poor Black girls who were at once society's most disempowered people and some of its most incisive social critics. These writers forced readers to grapple with the pain and trauma, beauty and joy that define their protagonists' lives. Now, initially, it seemed as if this explosion had come out of nowhere. But in fact, as we would soon discover, there had been generations of Black women writers. I went off to graduate school determined to study them. That proved something of a fool's errand, since I knew more about my area of study than my professors did. But like the women in my cohort, inspired by the stories we were reading, they and I determined to invent ourselves as literary historians and scholars. Our task overlapped with that of historians and scholars of religion as well. First, part of our work was recuperation. We followed Alice Walker in search of our mother's gardens to find not only the singers, quilters, and gardeners she memorialized in her classic essay, but literally generations of writers. Zora Neale Hurston, of course, but also Jessie Fawcett, Nella Larson, and Anne Spencer of the early 20th century, and 19th century writers like Harriet Jacobs, Frances Watkins Harper, and Harriet Wilson. Excuse me. Part of our work was to devise, this is two, a critical practice worthy of the fiction and poetry Black women artists had and were producing. What critical tools did we need to read this work fully, to analyze the intricacies of its plots, the psychology of its characters, and the wonder of its language? In 1977, Barbara Smith published an article titled "Toward a Black Feminist Criticism," which gave a name to the enterprise. Point 3, part of our work was theorizing. That is to say, we needed to do more than read discrete text in isolation. We needed to develop a context in which specific text might be read. In 1980, Barbara Christian published Black Women Novelists, The Development of a Tradition, 1892 to 1976. I have to say that that book and When and Where I Enter, these were some of the first books I purchased in hardcover because I couldn't wait until they came out in paperback. Other scholars, notably Hazel Carby and Mary Helen Washington, began to interrogate the usefulness of the concept of tradition, since it had been used so often to exclude women. In 1987, I'm sorry, I convened a conference at Rutgers titled "Changing Our Own Words, Black Women Writers, Theory and Criticism," in order to think how a Black feminist language should sound. I took the phrase, "Am I lead?" from Hurston, whose theorizing had always impressed me as original, insightful, and rooted in the experience of Black women. Alongside our sisters across disciplines, Black feminist literary scholars began to refine theories of intersectionality. The legal theorist Kimberly Crenshaw named the theory, but in her articles she acknowledged the contributions of literary scholars like Barbara Smith and May Henderson to her thinking. My own work continued with my books on women of the Harlem Renaissance, in which women of the Harlem Renaissance that look back to generations of writers and artists of the early 20th century, and then Worrying the Line, Black Women Writers, Lineage and Literary Tradition, in which I discharged my debt to those writers who had shifted the landscape of around 1970 and beyond. And I know the students are changing class. Thank you so much for your presence and your attention, and go where you need to be. When I began this journey, I tried to collect first editions of every book of fiction published by an African-American woman. I had to give that up circa 1985. There were too many books for my house to hold, books in every genre, from every region of the United States, and now from every corner of the globe. Black women writers continue to produce ever more amazing work at a staggering rate, and thus ensure that we critics will never run out of new texts to read, analyze, and theorize. I want to emphasize that my work has always been part of a collective enterprise. In September, I was part of a group invited to Duke University to participate in a symposium titled Black Women Writers at Work. My sister panelists included Thaddeus Davis, Carol Boyce Davis, Hazel Carby, Deborah McDowell, Beverly Guy Shuftall, and Mary Helen Washington. We missed Hortense Spillers, Carla Holloway, and Michelle Wallace. The conference title was an homage to Claudia Tate, who passed some years ago. I titled my reflections, "Sheer Good Fortune," a phrase I borrowed from Toni Morrison's dedication to Sula, and which sums up my career that began around 1970 in the midst of a Black women's literary renaissance that unfolded as new strategies of reading and interpretation were honed, and that continues at a time of unprecedented cultural production. I have been fortunate to be part of a community of thinkers and friends that has nurtured and strengthened my work. I urge you to forge community. It will make your work stronger. And I've just been thinking, and so the students are still here, I'm glad, because these words are for you. I urge you all to find work that you enjoy, that has meaning to you and to others, and that has the potential to make a difference in the world. That seems like a lot to ask, I know, but it is our legacy, the legacy of the women whose stories Paula Giddings tells in When and Where I Enter. It is Giddings' own legacy, as she makes eloquently clear in the preface to her book. It is your legacy. May you claim it freely and fiercely. Thank you.
Yeah. So the panelists have helped me out a lot by answering basically all the questions I had written down, which is good because we're just a little bit short on time. So I'm going to ask a quick question. And if there's one person from the audience who might move to this microphone, and we'll go through one of their questions and then our time will be done. So the one question I'm left with after my questions about who inspired you, how you changed your field, have now been answered, is sort of what do you think of the state of the fields in which you have been so influential, and what are some of the areas where you would say, that's not my project, but I really hope that some person would pick up and tell this story in Black women's studies? We'll start with you, Dr. Williams. Yeah.
In my field, I think, yes, thank you. In my field of womanist theology, feminist theology, one of my great concerns, and one of the things I find myself pushing, certainly the younger scholars, is to move beyond the deconstructive work and to move more toward the constructive work of Black women's religious history, Black women's hermeneutic, if you will. I think that I'm concerned, and I know it's the nature of dissertation writing. There is that first chapter of the lit review, and I understand that it is a large part of our work. We have taught students very well how to be critics, but we have not taught them how to move to the next level of constructing and doing the innovative, creative work. But what I think that happened in my field, I can't speak to other fields, is that a lot of the Black women writers that I'm reading in the biblical field, in the religious field, we spend a lot of time, they're spending a lot of time differentiating themselves from what they call this first generation of Black women scholars. And their first wave, second wave, third wave, and we have a song in church that says, I used to laugh at those people who went to church and stayed all day, but now I'm one of them. Yeah. And so now I think I'm one of them. I think I'm one of those mothers of the field, and I'm like, what? I'm not your mother. I'm not a But we are now considered that first wave and particularly in the biblical and religious field, those of us, the scholars, that we are that first wave. And there's a lot of time spent on differentiating their work from ours. And I think that there's a necessary part of that in the dissertation writing and in academia. But then there's the other part of let's move on to the next level, because we are not the enemy. We are not your threat. The more constructive work is taking on the larger patriarchal texts that we have inherited. So I think that's certainly, I mean, I could go on, but let me just, I'll stop right there and say that's the work that I think that this next generation, this third wave, are involved in, and I want to see, and I want to encourage.
Thank you. My young scholars do work on topics and with resources with archives that would never have occurred to me to use. I think this is a good thing because they can mine sources in popular culture that were off the limits to us. I wrote about blues women, but it did not occur to me to write about the women whose music filled my life and spirit because that was just what I did. That wasn't what I studied. And I think that that has opened up all kinds of possibilities. And I'm not just talking about the women who work on hip hop, but other objects that they use the skills that come out of Black feminist training, but they're applying them to new sources and creating new conversations. And I find that very, very exciting.
I guess I would say something about two works that I would love to see extended. One published some time ago and one recent. So the first is in Chana-Kai Lee's biography of Fannie Lou Hamer, an amazing book. Part of what's really amazing about it is that she's trying to write a history of Black women's pain. And I think the work that she's doing there and then sort of thinking about how we can tell a history of pain and of Black women's pain and pain as a historical force is something I would like to see people pick up and work on. And then more recently, Bettina Judd in Black Women's Studies has written this amazing article, Sapphire as Praxis, which is a methodology of anger and how to understand Black women's anger as theory. And so then how to ask when you are confronting Black women's anger, what's the information in that anger and what's the theory in that anger? I'm teaching Introduction to Black Women's Studies this semester, and we have spent a lot of the semester really trying to think about anger and to take her methodology and to move past thinking about, so like what's the emotion there, and to understand that anger as intellectual theory and to work it through as theory. And I would love to see people picking that up and teaching it, but also picking that up as the methodology that she intends it to be.
Thank you so much. So I have been informed I have more time.
Okay.
Although I just alerted the person who gave me more time that I was out of questions. But I will continue anyway. So one of the questions that I think each of you touched upon lightly that I think it would be interesting to hear you more is, talk about more is how you, the specific questions that you took up in your careers around Black women. Often I know in my own work, the question usually develops in my own life. In some way, it starts to come at me, and it keeps coming back, and then I apply the kind of methodological rigor I have been trained in to a question around which I feel some urgency about. And I was wondering how you came to those. Do you remember when you came to those early questions, and how the ways in which the works of Paula Giddings and other scholars helped you tell or answer a question or tell a story about which you had some personal urgency or just an intense curiosity to know, how did this begin? Who were these women? And how those questions arose. Go ahead.
When I wrote a book called Worrying the Line, Black Women Writers, Lineage and Literary Tradition, I was reading a number of novels that were really important to me, Song of Solomon, Praise Song for the Widow, Corregidora. And I was interested in this idea of how these writers used history, and particularly focusing on family histories, and that in each text there was a moment when the protagonist reached the end of the line in terms of written documentation. And my question was, well, how did they still create that history? And rereading those texts, I realized, well, this one had the epiphany in a dream. This one was listening to music, in Song of Solomon, where he hears the children's song and realizes that they're talking about my family. And I can trace it back further. Or they had a conversation with another person, real or imagined, and that person figure gave them the information. So I was interested in the determination to get to the end of the story and the means by which they were able to get to that end even though there was no written documentation. And this is one of the differences, right, between historians and literary figures, because we can make it up. But that was really going back to see how, in fact, those characters made that connection. That was the question that motivated that study.
I relied on novels, fiction, to help understand how Black women understood biblical texts, how Black women use Christianity to, in fact, as Toni Morrison said, to reinvent themselves and also to reinvent Christianity. And the ways in which, so for me, it was a question of how has Christianity shaped Black women, but also how have Black women taken white Christianity and reshaped it to become activists. So how do these texts that on one level oppress, have been used to oppress, but how have Black people, particularly Black women, turned these texts around and used them as the impetus and the inspiration to become warriors and activists and very strong women in their community. So that for me was very important. The question of the ways in which religion has been used, particularly Christian texts have been used. And I needed the writings of, I needed Sula, I needed Pilate in the book of Song of Solomon, I needed the writings of Margaret Walker, I needed those kinds of texts in order to say this is how what Black women have done.
Okay. Dr. Barkley-Brown.
Good morning.
Get her and then I'll come back.
I'm
Yes.
Sarah Williams.
Well, hold on.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Go ahead, I'll
Okay, go
come
ahead.
back.
Oh, okay. Sociologist and social worker. So I have strong opinions about this, but I'd like for you to speak to it. The reason is I had the experience of this weekend with being with some of the Jetsons. And me being a part of the Flintstones. I would like for you to speak to younger people, perhaps. I'm so happy that we have Black Women Studies, but this person was speaking of code switching and wondering of the importance of African American women's position in society. I would like for each one of you to speak of that because some people believe that as African American women, young, let's say 18 to 22, their goal should be to fit in, become a part of corporate America, to speak the King's English. That is how they intend to, quote unquote, make it. But how can we emphasize that we, in fact, need to recognize the importance of being an African American woman and not just someone who will fit in with corporate America in order to make it in society? First of all, can you do that? Can you really? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
That might be a ridiculous question, but I think it bears.
No, we're all teachers. There are no ridiculous questions.
No ridiculous question.
So, who would like to begin?
I think we have to learn how to code switch. And I'm always thinking about, I know Morrison is on our minds and in our hearts. But when I think, one of my favorite Morrison quotes, not from a novel, is when she tells the story about being a little girl and her parents sent her out to do day's work. And she came back and she was complaining about that experience to her father. And her father She didn't want to go back. And father said, you don't live there, you live here. And that quote has resounded with me for decades. It's something I tell my students. It's something I tell my daughter. You can't live there. You know, you've got to live here with the people who love you and the people who care about you and the people who care about your future and protect. So you got to go out there. You got to go to work. But you do need to always have that sense of who you are, and that you don't fit in, you remain yourself, and you do the job, and then you come home.
Well, one more question. We're going to take another question.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Brianna. I'm a sociology major, African American studies minor. And in a recent interview, Angela Davis talked about how there's always been a disconnect between Black social movements and women's social movements. So I wanted, what's actually two questions. But one, why do you all believe there's such a disconnect? And then two, what can we as younger Black women do to allow society to view it as intersectional issues? Like, how can we?
Did you say disconnect? No, I don't know what.
So I'm going to try and rephrase your question because we couldn't hear you very well here on stage.
I can repeat it.
She can repeat it louder.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Okay, so basically there's, Angela Davis described how there's always been a disconnect between Black social movements and women's social movements. So why do you all believe that there's such a disconnect? And then how can we as younger Black women, what can we do to make them be viewed as intersectional issues?
Mm-hmm. Who would like to go first?
I thought maybe the historian would like to.
Dr. Barker.
Yeah, I'm going So I might actually start a bit with the premise. I think actually studying Black women and thinking about how Black women have developed a particular political ideology shows the ways in which exactly Anna Julia Cooper, shows the ways in which the struggles of working class people, the struggles of women, the struggles of men of color, et cetera, shows what they have in common. And helps us understand the kinds of social structures that are designed to make us think we don't have anything in common, and to kind of try to reimagine a world. So I think thinking through the lens of Black women who have to think the world through issues of race and through issues of sex, class, but also to imagine that everyone has to think the world through that. Some people have the privilege of thinking that this is a women's movement, or some people have the privilege of thinking this is a Black movement, but none of those are actually true. There, there's Black men, there's Black women, there's everybody's sort of involved in that together. So I think partly just taking each one of those and unpacking what we mean by Black movement, and then who are all the people in there, and how is that, how do those particular struggles shape us differently? What do we mean by a women's movement, and who do we think that is, and who is silenced in that? So I think for almost anything we want to do, the first question we have to ask is who has been silenced by naming a movement in a particular kind of way? Whose struggle is not included when we name it a Black movement? Whose struggle is not included when we name it a women's movement? And then how do we think about those silences and unpack those silences, and then who's a part of the conversation if we if we can try to move past those silences. So I would start with the question of silence, like who's being silenced in the naming of whatever we're doing.
I think that for many of us, we are brilliant in our race analysis, but I think we are rather kindergarten and naive in our analysis of sexism, particularly as black women. And I'm trying to think of the quote, and I don't understand why I can't remember the quote. But some of us are brave. All the
blacks are men.
All the blacks are men.
All the women are white.
All the women are white. But some of us are brave. And I recommend that book. I certainly recommend that book to you. But also that notion that as black women having to invent ourselves and recognizing, but also understanding the intersectionality of our work in all of these fields. So I think that's part of our ongoing work as black women.
Thank you. That is the end of